Some analysis on this. Tom Packer is joining us from London. He is a fellow at the Rothermere American Institute at Oxford University. Tom, thank you for your time here on TRT World's special election coverage. Give us a sense as to whether there is a difference, a notable difference, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat that is occupying the Oval Office when it comes to sanctions globally.
I mean, there's been a general trend towards increasing the number of sanctions over the years, and the presence of both parties. I think it might often affect who gets sanctioned. So Republicans nowadays tend to be keener on sanctioning Iran, though Democrats definitely do it a lot. That was even more true when there was actually maybe interesting relationship with your polarization one. I think it's a fair case that two parties were actually further apart from foreign policy in the 80s. So Democrats were, and some Republicans were very keen on sanctioning South Africa. Republicans were keen on sanctioning communist countries. But the general trend has been increasing sanctions. Partly, of course, we now live in quite a free trade era. So when it was more protectionist 60 years ago or so, there was less need to have sanctions because you weren't trading in the first place. So, but there is definitely a long-term trend having a very large number of very different sanctions across a huge part of the world. Some countries like Iran and North Korea, very extensive sanctions. Some countries less extensive, but a lot of sanctions.
Right, and Tom, I think the big question here is whether or not these sanctions work, because multiple studies have been conducted and some suggest that sanctions don't work as they are intended to. Take Iran, for example. The US first imposed sanctions on Iran back in 1979, but was the US really able to contain Iran through these sanctions? I mean, many would say the answer is a resounding no.
I think it's. I suppose I would have sort of several points. One is that I don't think there's necessarily a one size fits all. Some sanctions might be very badly conceived. Some sanctions might be a very good idea. That I don't think one should, because precisely because there are so many and they vary so much in what they're doing. So, for example, I think some of the sanctions that seek to restrict weapons might be particularly, I think, generally justified in that if you have bad relations with a country, you don't want them to have sophisticated weapon systems that they can use to invade, or potentially even threaten yourself. I think they vary a lot. It's also just very hard to tell, right? So let's give the Iranian example, which, as you say, on the face of it, it looks like a complete failure. On the other hand, there was massive war with Iran and Iraq in the 80s. Like, if there hadn't been the sanctions, maybe Iran would have conquered Iraq, swept onto the whole Middle East, turned itself into a much more dangerous threat to the United States. Um, I do think that one thing I particularly emphasize is one, the tendency for sanctions to just stick around for decades, long after the original idea behind them has gone. So the US tends not to get rid of them very fast or a lot. And then another thing I'd also emphasize is the degree to which sanctions are often more powerful prospectively. But of course, if you never impose sanctions, people aren't going to believe you're doing it. And you can get ironies where, so for example, I think there's quite a strong case, not so much the US, but Europe. If Western Europe, sorry, if when Russia had invaded, they've realized the extent of the sanctions that would be imposed, I think they might not have done it. There's this weird thing that people then impose sanctions once they get outraged afterwards without threatening it in advance. If you're going to impose sanctions for doing something, it's a good idea to say in advance you're going to do them rather than just do them when you get outraged. It looks politically necessary after the evasions actually happened. So I think the sanctions policy hasn't necessarily been very well conceived. If I may, I'd also just make one sort of big generic point, which is the US is like the most powerful country in the world. So like it was less true, but like say 100 years ago, Britain was arguably the most powerful country in the world, or 200, 150 years ago. And Britain had a massive empire that conquered a quarter of the world. So one way of seeing things like sanctions is they're actually much more moderate than most dominant powers. Most dominant powers have tended to form empires and conquer or at least impose tribute on other powers. So I think one way you could see the sanctions is the US as hegemon is actually more moderate than most powers would have been as hegemon, where they'd be more likely to actually conquer countries or control them directly rather than just impose sanctions when they do something they don't like.